Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Bernard Lu, and I'm the chair for this webinar today, which is part of a series of events that the Rajaratnam School of International Studies has planned to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, which was obviously set up in 1996. Today, what we have is a webinar, a debate between two thought leaders in their respective fields, focusing on the question of security in the 21st century and whether or not each of their respective areas, security studies or strategic studies, offers the better insights into the security problems of the 21st century. The way this debate is going to go is I will invite each speaker to speak for 15 minutes to present their case for their respective areas before there will be a question and answer session involving the two speakers, and then thereafter a question and answer session to be open to our audience today. You both know the names of the two speakers. You have seen their respective CVs and their biography, bio data. So I'm not going to go in any more into that, other than to thank both of them for agreeing to this event. And at this point in time, I would like to invite Professor Heng to kick off the debate. Professor Heng, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Bernard. It's a real pleasure to join you today for this 25th anniversary event. Bernard's asked me to speak to security studies. So what I would like to do is to, just go back to basics first. And security is essentially a contested concept. And we've seen different takes and different twists and turns in terms of how to understand, interpret security. We have the traditionalists who focus on military state-centric threats. We have the post-Cold War wideners and the deepeners. We also have scholars who focus and zero in on globalization's impact. But I would also like to say that let's not forget that there is a ghost in the machine in the form of what I have termed as returnism. And what this means essentially is that the previous security agenda that you thought might have disappeared, or classical concepts that were seen to be irrelevant, they never actually really disappeared. And I also think that they often have a knack of resurfacing as well. So what do we mean by security studies? Briefly speaking, a whole bunch of questions here. What is security? Whose security are we talking about? How is it being threatened? How to provide security? What counts as a security issue? Now, I think if you take this bunch of questions and you look at the world around us, it gives us great insight into what I argue would be 5 key dimensions of the security agenda today. Firstly, uncertainty. Second, capturing the zeitgeist. Third, complexity. Fourth, returnism. And fifth, inflexibility and adaptability of the military instrument. And I'll take each of these questions and issues in turn. So, but to begin with, firstly, how is security being threatened? We see, in the initial post-Cold War period, a very clear concern with uncertainty, right? And this is captured in NATO's very first post-Cold War strategic concept, which argued that the predominant threat has disappeared. Instead, we face risks that are multifaceted and also multi-directional. And with this focus on uncertainty, a group of scholars, including myself, have looked at the implications of ideas of risk and thinking about how that might apply to security studies. And here, one of my favorite Bushisms, I think, actually very neatly captures this concern with uncertainty. So George W. Bush here saying that, we are not so sure who the they are, but we know they are there. So on 9/11, unfortunately, Bush received a sort of an answer to this question of where and how security threats might manifest. Then his defense secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, actually extends this focus on uncertainty even deeper with, as you might know, his infamous discussion on this notion of unknown unknowns as a justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And Donald Rumsfeld has consistently made the point that uncertainty has become a huge challenge for security planners, right? How to defend our nation against the unknown, the uncertain, the unseen, and also the unexpected. Now, I think in Singapore's case, many of these broader global security trends have been reflected, for example, in the National Security Strategy of 2004, which argues that the armed forces was previously tasked with tackling clear military challenges from state-based threats, but it recognizes that the regional security environment has become increasingly complex and different. So as a result, we also saw the development of attempts to better understand what might be lurking just over the horizon. So one example of this was the risk assessment and horizon scanning system, which was precisely set up in such a way that policy planners would then be able to better understand, right, what might just be lurking just over the horizon. So Peter Ho, for example, very clearly argued that we do not know where the next major strategic surprise may even originate. So let me move to the second question: what counts as a security issue? And I think if you look at this picture here of Greta Thunberg pictured at a climate protest in Brussels, one of the protesters, complained that, essentially it's pick your evil, right? Do you want to die from global warming or do you want to die from a coronavirus? So I think this really captures the contemporary zeitgeist, where we see increasing concern with a bunch of existential risks. And this would be, for example, risks that could lead to human extinction or civilizational collapse. And we have lots of different research centers that are working on this particular aspect of existential risks. And inevitably, we find that there's quite a lot of concern with AI and climate change. So again, if you look at these types of attempts to scan and to map global anxieties, we have the Global Risks Report, which are published every year by the World Economic Forum. We also have the Lloyd's Register Foundation's World Risk Poll. These again point to great concerns, right, over climate change and AI and cyber insecurity. So just quickly to look at the most recent IPCC report on climate change. It's not looking good, right? Many island nations on the edge of extinction. It is a code red for humanity. The Maldives is facing the single biggest existential threat. And of course, in Singapore's case, Prime Minister Lee has also talked about how climate change is existential and also a life and death matter. Now, to make things even more complicated, we have a huge amount of complexity and intertwined security issues. And we see this, for example, with great power competition and climate change. The US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, given a speech back in April where he talked about how difficult it is to imagine the US winning long-term strategic competition with China if it cannot lead the renewable energy revolution. And again, if you look at the Global Risks report in 2020, this is one of my favorite maps from this report on the right, and it shows again this level of interconnection and also complexity in terms of the security risks that we currently face. And the most recent report argues that climate change risks intersecting with societal fractures and also COVID fallout to create severe consequences. So let me turn then to the fourth point. However, we still see a ghost in the machine. And if you look, for example, at the 2002 US National Security Strategy, which was formulated right after 9/11, it actually seems to be from a rather different era. And this document argued that, terrorism was now the #1 threat. The world's great powers find ourselves on the same side, and was relatively optimistic about Russia and China. And when you compare that with Donald Trump's national security strategy of 2017, it very clearly now flips to the other side and argues that the revisionist powers of China and Russia are the greatest challenges to American power, and therefore the US now has to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades. Now, again, these trends are reflected in the UK's most recent integrated review, which, of course, people talk about the Indo-Pacific tilt. But I think what's also interesting was how Prime Minister Boris Johnson also emphasized that countries like the UK have to what he called relearn, right, the art of competing against states with opposing values. And I think it's also very interesting when you look at how partners in the region, for example, Japan, have welcomed the UK's enhanced presence in the Indo-Pacific. The then Foreign Minister Kuang said that we greatly welcome a British return to the east of the Suez. So all these themes of returnism are again making an appearance. And finally, let me turn to the final question, how to provide security and by which actors. And here, I think we should be quite careful in terms of how security studies and strategic studies position themselves, right? I think it's more accurate to think of them in terms of overlapping concentric circles, as Richard Batts has argued, rather than two separate entities altogether. So security studies would be seen as the most inclusive ring, whereas strategic studies would be the middle circle, looking at how political and military means interact. So if you look at the military instruments, it still remains one of the most flexible and adaptable tools to address the complex world that we live in. And this is a point also made by the former US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So for example, if you look at how the Singapore Armed Forces have deployed since the end of the Cold War, we've seen numerous deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor, HADR missions, counter-IS coalition, anti-piracy patrols, and military exercises with numerous security partners. Again, if you look at the recent, Indo-Pacific deployments of the UK's carrier strike group, we see a similar pattern. On its way to the east, it engaged in NATO exercises, freedom of navigation operations in the Black Sea, airstrikes against IS, anti-piracy exercises with Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. Let's not forget, both these armed forces were also very heavily involved in COVID responses as well. So the military very much still retains a crucial role. However, we do recognize that there is limited utility of military force in addressing security challenges today, especially the economy security nexus. As Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has recently mentioned, geostrategic competition today will be engaged in the economic realm, right? So we will be thinking about how to cope with economic coercion. And just last year, Japan added an economic division to its National Security Secretariat. So if you think of the deterioration in US-China relations, it's very clearly linked to economic and security issues. And we also see the rise of weaponized interdependence as well. So let me make some conclusions here. How are we to deal with returnism? We've seen, lots of recent literature trying to tackle, again, questions of deterrence. Just to give some examples here, Brown and his collaborators have prepared a book on the return of deterrence. Lebo and Zhang have talked about deterrence and reassurance in the Sino-US relationship. I myself have written recently about reassurance for strategic partners. Blankenship's talked about reassurance again for former allies. And let's not forget, of course, the famous book by Ellison on the Thucydides trap and power transition. So these are all attempts, really, to deal with returnism, but we also need to cope with uncertainty. And here we see a growing interest in national risk assessment exercises. For example, in 2018, the OECD has published a report looking at 20 OECD members who have all conducted their own national risk assessments. And Malaysia, of course, is also developing its own national risk register. So what might be some of the implications for Singapore? And I think this is particularly interesting because Singapore, like the UK, has engaged and invested resources in capacity building and also developing futures literacy. For example, in the UK, the Government Office of Science has developed a futures toolkit and has developed teams to help to embed futures training and tools across government. The Department for Environment in the UK, which is not normally a security-focused agency, has also launched a futures project on global catastrophic risks. And in the case of Singapore, the Center for Strategic Futures has been launching futurecraft workshops for civil servants, scenario planning toolkits, and also been actively nurturing futurists across ministries and agencies. And again, I think Peter Ho was absolutely right to say that it's critical to have departments like health and education in these types of attempts to forecast the future. They are not traditional security partners, but they will be in future. And my final slide here is, I think, the biggest question of all: whose security are we talking about? And I think we are now looking at increasingly significant questions about intergenerational justice. So several examples here: the Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg's infamous death stare at Donald Trump, and youth disillusionment is now classed as a top 10 global risk in the most recent global risk report. And there are ongoing attempts to think about how to protect the future with the draft Future Generations Bill that's ongoing in the UK, which calls for preventative spending to stop future generations being affected by issues that could have been avoided today. So I think we do need to think about how to protect future generations from actions that we fail to undertake today or actions that we might have mistakenly undertaken today. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Heng. So at this juncture, I would like to invite Dr. Pascal Vennesson to deliver his remarks about the value of strategic studies. Dr. Vennesson.
Thank you so much, Bernard, and good morning to everybody. It's absolutely terrific to be here, and I'd like just to thank you so much for organizing this event, for inviting me to participate. And it's also wonderful to see Kuang again. It's been a long time, also due to COVID, among other things. So it's terrific to have this opportunity to exchange about things that we both care about very much, and that on which we've both tried to contribute this complex relationship between strategy and security. So it's a wonderful opportunity. I'm delighted to be here with you. So give me 1 second. I'm going to put on my slides here and do this wonderful screen sharing in an amazingly technologically sophisticated way. So right now you should see my slides, but through some sort of miracle. Frankly, I still don't get it. But I think it works now, and I hope you can hear me fine and you can see me as well. All right, so basically Bernard asked us, and we were joking about that before this session with Kuang, because he asked us, you know, you've seen this provocative title with strategic studies or security studies versus strategic studies, and we both said that maybe, just maybe, we may be in agreement on too many things, actually, not so much in disagreement, but I'll do my best to find some sort of difference. Now, let me begin by telling you that I am not sure whether or not today, as opposed as the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War, you know, early 1990s, there were indeed some expression of disagreements, and for a variety of reasons. But whether or not today there is a strong opposition between strategic studies and security studies, I'm not too sure. And I think, building up on what Kuang just shared, I think that actually there are a number of commonalities or shared issues and problems. Now, whether or not there is some sort of disconnect between the two, yes, probably there is. I'm not sure that there is a deep level of engagement between the two, so we can discuss about that. Where there might be some element of disconnect there. I would also agree, but that we can further discuss that, of course, together later. I think it would be fair to say that there has been, over the last maybe 10, 20 years, a relative neglect of strategy and strategic ideas in security studies, and perhaps more broadly in the study of international relations. Yes, that I believe that this has been happening, at least to some degree. Now, we should also admit that such a disconnect might not necessarily be a bad thing, right? You know, after all, one could say that those connections may simply not be needed. After all, there might be a sort of healthy focus on different issues, and if there is a healthy focus on different issues, there is nothing wrong about that, right? There is a sort of division of labor, and you know, it's completely fine. It's actually a good development. Now, however, it's also true that there are situations in which more engagement, more connection might be needed between strategic thought and security studies, might be desirable. And if so, I think it's a fair question to ask, how can this be done, right? In what ways this could be achieved in a productive way? So let me, in order to address that question, I'd like to discuss with you and further discuss these 3 points. So the first step, I think, and it's really following along the line that Kuang actually just did for security and security studies, is just to try to be clear about what is it that strategic studies and strategic thought, right, brings to the table. Is there something specific, if you will, in the ways in which and the topics that are covered by a strategic study? So I'd like to say a few words about that. Then I'd like to share with you some ways in which perhaps strategy has been misunderstood. And I just a couple of points. I've done some work on this, and I'm happy to share with you at the end of my presentation some additional references if you're interested. And then also tell you, where do we go from here, right? What could be potential agendas about strategy and about connections between strategic studies and security studies. This is my definition of strategic studies. I believe that most people working within the strategic studies tradition would agree with that definition. But of course, scholars and also practitioners love to disagree about different things. So I'm not saying that everybody would completely agree, but there is a general sense that it's an interdisciplinary field of studies. It's not just one discipline. Actually, it's usually made of the contribution of many different disciplines. And at the core of that field, there is an interest in the preparation, the threat, the use, the control, the consequences of organized force to achieve political ends. Now, we also use this definition within RSIS in our attempt to clarify what our master in strategic studies is all about. And the only point that I would like to flag on this definition is that, as you can see, this definition does not specify any specific, any particular strategic actor, right? It's agnostic about the answer to who is involved. And in particular, this definition, I'll come back to this point further in a minute in my talk, this definition does not say, for example, that it's about states necessarily, right? It's the consequences, the use of organized violence can be done by many different actors, not just states, but we can further discuss that later. Now, of course, trying to identify the specificities of strategic studies and strategic thought and action is not an easy task. And I don't want to give you the impression that I will give you now a sort of the final answer to this. But at the very least, I'd like to flag and to highlight three key dimensions, which, at least for me, are really at the core of strategic studies. And this is the first of these definitions, and it's the policy and politics connection. What we should call perhaps the Sun-Tzu-Clausewitz consensus, right? Sun-Tzu and Clausewitz are very different in many ways, belong to different cultures, belong to different moments in times, have been dealing with different issues, etc. So there are many different things in their strategic thinking. But there is one central point on which they both agree, right? At the heart of strategy, there is this necessity to balance political ends and military means, right? Force and the use of force is never, according to them, and maybe we should say it should never be an isolated activity, okay? Politics and policy are an absolute necessity because they give meaning and they give purpose to force. So one of the key questions in strategic studies, in strategic thinking, is really this mutual relationship between political ends and ways and means, okay? And it's a difficult relationship because it's not just top down. It's just not political leadership saying, oh, you do this, but it's also the specific characteristic of the strategic instruments, plural, and also the specific conduct of strategic action, which has also an impact on the political end. So my bottom line on this is that if political leaders, if practitioners, or if analysts, if scholars are interested in pure policy questions or pure questions related to force, they're not doing strategy. They're not doing strategy. Strategy is going to be fundamentally about the connection between the two and why it works in some cases, why it doesn't work in others, etc., etc. So that's the first component. The second key aspect for me about strategy and strategic thought is really this notion that there is a clash between two opposing wills, right? Strategy is not something that I can do alone. In technical, slightly technical game theoretic terms, it's not a game against nature. Okay, there is someone, and so you can formulate that in an abstract way. So, and I give you on this slide a couple of examples. Clausewitz talks about polarity. He takes the image of a duel between two adversaries, a sort of wrestling match, if you will. Thomas Schelling, of course, inspired by game theory in the 1950s and 60s, would talk about interaction. French General André Beauf would talk about a dialectic between self and other, right? A dialectic, a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis, right? There is this, but it's not one actor, right? It's this complex relation between two resourceful, thinking adversaries. And you can see here that what do? They seek to oppose, deflect, reverse each other's move. Now, for strategic studies, this is really crucial. It's really crucial because if you accept this premise, there are lots of potential implications. And I won't summarize all of them now, but it's what Edouard Luttwak summarized with this notion of the paradoxical logic of strategy. If I have this potential opponent, and if I know that these opponents will react to what I'm doing, then I must find ways to surprise that opponent, right? To pursue the line of least expectation, for example. What comes as a fundamental point is this question of surprise, is what are the risks that I'm ready to take in order to surprise this adversary? There is also the problem of friction, right? What I do is one thing, but there will be also what the adversary is doing to limit my capacity to do a number of things. Last but not least, this notion of culminating, right, and point of victory, for example, culmination and reversal, right? In strategy, when I find something that is working right now, I should start to be really careful. Why? Because it's unlikely to continue to work. And it's unlikely to continue to work, guess what? Because in front of me, there is an actor who is adapting, who is trying to find counters to my action. So my bottom line on this is, once again, if practitioners and if scholars are studying phenomena in which the reacting will of an adversary has no role, right? It can be brackets, essentially. They're not dealing with strategy, right? They are dealing with administrative questions. They're dealing with domain in which linear thinking is prevalent, but it's not going to be about strategy. Finally, the question of force. So yes, in strategy, classically speaking, in the long history of strategic thought, force is extremely important, right? A variety of coercive instruments, whether they're virtual or whether they are actual, or whether they're used, this is really important from a strategic perspective. Now, note, however, the nuance, right? I'm saying force because from the perspective of strategic studies, it's not necessarily war. And this is, of course, the big change. This is the revolution of the Cold War, and it's the revolution of nuclear weapons. Okay, before 1945, and Clausewitz would be a good example, but you can pick any strategic thinker of the prior 1945 period. Strategy started when the war started. Strategy was really part of what war was all about. Today, the way we would see this would be to say that's the operational level of war, right? But at that time, it was strategy as a whole. Since 1945, because we are still, of course, living in this world, war is embedded into strategy. Strategy is the larger category. Now, war still matters, mind you, right? War is still a very specific way of force employment, and it can matter. But it's only one type of force employment among many others. And you can see on these slides many different aspects, which previously, so some of them were brand new. So the arms control, for example, that was an innovation of the Cold War. Others are older, but when they were used in prior period, they were not perceived as part of strategy. They were something else. They were diplomacy, they were political relations, they were other things, but not strategy. And therefore, within strategy today, I would include weapon system acquisition. Weapon system acquisition, right? When Singapore announces publicly that it will acquire the F-35, this is a strategic move. Not just because the capability of the Republic of Singapore Air Force will be improved, but because by announcing this publicly, Singaporean leadership is trying to influence others, to shape the perception and reactions of others. That's a strategic move. And the plane does not even exist, right? Or at least it is not used in combat. They're not starting a war, okay? So my bottom line on this, and by the way, just to go back to one point that Kuang raised earlier, when the Australian Prime Minister is talking very correctly, in my view, about economic coercion, right? That's strategy. That's part that economic, right? Economic power might not be in and of itself force, but it's part of an attempt to influence other, right? To exercise some sort of coercive power. That falls, in my view, within the category of strategic studies. Now, therefore, if there is a complete absence of force and coercion, again, it's not strategy. So my bottom line on this, and I'll close in a few minutes. My bottom line is that when we're talking about the future relevance of strategic studies, if we still live in a world in which the connection between political ends and military means matter, in which there will be strategic interaction between different actors, and in which force or a variety of coercive tools are still playing a role in international affairs, then strategy will continue to be relevant. Now, there are a number of misunderstandings about strategy. I won't go through all of them, but I just want to flag just the first one, and you can ask me a question. We can come back on the others later. I think many people have been perceiving strategy as being state-centric. And I think from strategic studies, instead, what you do when you look at what strategic thinkers have been doing and been saying is that they do recognize that state certainly matters. But strategic studies has actually never been state-centric. Clausewitz himself devoted an entire book, now recently translated into English, to sort of so-called irregular warfare involving all sorts of non-state actors. So I think there has been a misperception here that strategy means necessarily states. States matter, but they're certainly not the only strategic actor. My final point is, where do we go from here? So again, I cannot flag an entire agenda. I hope we can further exchange on this. And these are only limited pointers where I see some very productive area of research that we are RSIS have been engaged in, and others have been also interested in. So first, the first area is really what I would call strategic mind. I really think that over the course of these last maybe 20 years, what we know about the human minds have been changing very significantly. We know much more about human cognition. Now, and my sense is that even though there has been a growing interest in those insights, in those results in other disciplines, in IR, in the study of foreign policy, up until now, the strategic studies has not fully incorporated those notions. And I think issues such as cognitive biases, intuition, the problem of overconfidence, the role of emotions in strategic decisions, there is really a vast domain here in which strategic studies should really incorporate those notions. We cannot continue with the simplistic notions of rationality that many strategic studies have been using so far. It has become much richer, much more interesting. We need cognition and emotions to better understand strategic minds and strategic decisions. That's the first thing. The second thing is that although I don't think that strategic studies is intrinsically Western-centric, I think it is true that the focus, due to the Cold War, due to a limitation of language, et cetera, has been covering quite a lot Western countries. And I really think that we should keep in mind that strategic thinkings have global roots. They're certainly not limited to the West. And so those working in strategic studies should continue to expand the range of strategic ideas that they study, that they examine. Asia is a good place to start, especially Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in many different countries. There are specific strategic traditions. There are a number of strategic thinkers that are a bit forgotten. And I think we need to bring them back. And nowadays there are a number of very important debates in the social sciences on race, racism, and politics in general. And I think the connection between race and strategy has been touched upon, but we've only scratching the surface. So I think there is also a very rich area here in which we could do fantastic things. Last but certainly not least, although over the course of these last 10 years, there has been a number of very exciting work done on the notion of grand strategy. Again, I have the feeling that the main focus has really been the United States of America, so US grand strategy, nothing wrong with that, of course, but the notion of grand strategy can be very profitable to analyze a wide range of issues in Asia Pacific and in the connection between Asia Pacific and the world. And I believe that with a grand strategy, we could bring together strategy and security in very insightful and promising ways. And I'll stop here, and I thank you so much. And for those of you who really are interested in more, I have a couple of additional references, and I'm sure we can make available this presentation afterwards, especially if you're an RSIS student and would like to know more. Thank you so much. And I'll stop the sharing of my slide right now. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vennesson. Okay, at this point in time, I would like to invite Professor Heng to with about 5 minutes to re-examine the case that Professor Vennesson has made. Professor Heng.
Sure. Thank you so much, Pascal. As you said, we are perhaps too much in alignment in our approach to this question, and I fear we might disappoint Bernard in his attempt for a debate, but I will try. First point I'd like to raise is your suggestion about strategic studies being an interdisciplinary field. I wonder how interdisciplinary is strategic studies today? For example, how open do you think the leading strategic theorists are actually open to other disciplines? For example, thinking about security studies, for example, just to make a comparison, security studies scholars have been, quite open to adapting work from the fields of sociology, criminology, for example. So I'm just wondering about how much, adaptability might strategic studies have in that aspect. So that's the first point. The second point, and I absolutely agree with you on the importance of defining strategic studies in terms of force, and what you mentioned about the different categories of force. I found really quite intriguing, especially your classification of disinformation or misinformation operations as a non-war type of force, and also the use of illegal immigrants as well. I wonder if you could expand a bit more on that particular point. I mean, how might disinformation be seen as a use of non-war type of force? And I think that's a particularly pertinent question, especially when we think about sort of Russian media interference and all these questions about disinformation and fake AI Twitter accounts and all that. So there's I think quite a lot you can explore in there as well. And just to related points. I suppose when we think about strategic studies, we usually focus, of course, on the military instruments. But as you rightly pointed out, there are broader ways in which compellence could be imposed and costs could be imposed as well. So how central should military power be to strategic studies, and also how central should military power be to this understanding of the use of force today? And the final question I have is, I think I was really fascinated by your point about emotions and overconfidence in strategic studies, and it reminded me of the current problems in Afghanistan, the US withdrawal, and when Biden announced the withdrawal back in was it April or something, he was very emotional, and he of course has a personal feel for the soldiers who are actually deployed. I mean, having lost his son in Iraq. Not in Iraq, but his son was also deployed in Iraq as well. So I think that definitely, is a factor in, the way in which the decision making, at least, was framed for Biden. Now, my question, though, is if we are to shift strategic studies into this field of psychology or perceptions or misperceptions, overconfidence, the messianic complexities that some leaders have, how can we retain the distinctive core of strategic studies if it moves into fields that have been covered, for example, by, as you mentioned, foreign policy analysis. And foreign policy analysis scholars have very, accurately looked at, this question of, prospect theory, for example, miscalculations, misperceptions, personality flaws. How can strategic studies retain its distinctive core in that regard? So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Heng. So at this point in time, I will invite Professor Vennesson to pose his series of questions for security studies. I would urge Professor Vennesson not to answer Professor Heng's questions as yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I'll do my best. I promise I'll do my best. I will refrain. Thank you so much, Kuang. Thank you so much for the question, by the way. Thank you. I hope we can continue, of course, this dialogue. So, and I enjoyed very much your broad sort of overview of a wide range of issues related to security studies, which would lead me also to my first question to you, even though let me again preface what I'm saying by recognizing that I think really there are more points of convergence and agreements between many of the things that we've been sharing today. So it's really but I do think that there is still room for interesting debate within that overall framework. So my first question to you is that I am actually very sympathetic with the way you presented the state of the debate and discussions in security studies. Not only am I sympathetic, but I really also believe that it's actually pretty accurate. That is to say, when I'm thinking about security studies, that's exactly what I generally have in mind. But my follow-up question is that still listening to you, right, I still have a difficulty to understand the boundaries of the phenomena, right? That is to say, to me, the way you presented it, and again, it's not due to your presentation. I think it's due to the characteristics of security studies and the way it's done. I see no limit, right? I am unable from what you've said to identify one way in which I could say, oh, that's outside somehow of what we study, or that's not really what we do, right? We've reached the point where security studies has become almost synonymous to social sciences, right? It's sociology as a whole. You mentioned yourself criminology, absolutely. And why stop there, right? So I see a challenge to find boundary. And I was wondering, first, do you feel in the same way? Is that crazy, or am I crazy about it? And number two, would you have, is that maybe you see that as positive, right? Maybe after all, why finding boundaries? So, but if you had a way to tell us what the limits would be, what would that be, right? What would that be? So that would be my first my first question. My second question has to do with what you highlighted very correctly. At some point, you discussed the problem of uncertainty, and it was an important aspect, I think, of your presentation, because this question of uncertainty is really related to what you said later about the sort of the risk analysis, the horizon, the effort to understand future scenarios and these kinds of things, right? It's because there is this uncertainty that all these other things become so crucial. Now, if I understood you correctly, you very much connected this problem of uncertainty and the fact that it became so important to the post-Cold War era, right? In the post-Cold War era, all of a sudden, there are these Bushism, there is the Rumsfeld, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I was wondering if you could share with us whether or not that, uncertainty does matter a great deal, but why do you think it's bounded to the post-Cold War era? After all, one could say in strategic thought, the problem of uncertainty has been there all along. In many ways, the security dilemma, right, one of the key notion in IR at the nexus between IR and strategic studies, right, the security dilemma is fundamentally related to this situation of uncertainty in which states find themselves, right? I don't know if what Bernard really think today, and I don't know what will he think tomorrow, right? And because of these really fundamental uncertainty, I'm going to start to do things to protect myself, but guess what? The things that I'm doing to protect myself, he will find threatening, right? So that fundamentally relies on the notion of uncertainty, but that's completely, pre-Cold War, pre-post-Cold War, it's completely fundamental in strategy, in IR. So it's not, would that be specific to the post-Cold War era? And my two final point is, you very correctly, and in fact you very correctly use the work of Richard Betts, and especially his piece on should strategic studies survive, and his notion of the concentric circles. Now, it's an interesting way to approach it, and to say that security studies would be the outer circle, and that strategy would occupy a middle point somewhere. Now, it's one interesting way to look at it. Now, let me just share with you another perspective, right? What would you think of a perspective in which strategic ideas can be actually at the core of very fundamental theorizing about international relations as a whole? That is to say, strategic studies might not be a subfield or a subdiscipline. Some aspect of strategic studies can help construct theories of international relations. Now, admittedly, it has been done in traditions that are less well known in what I would call the Anglo sphere, or it has been less well known in US political science. But I would suggest, for example, that the theory of international relations developed by Raymond Aron is fundamentally built on Raymond Aron's own understanding of the ideas of Clausewitz. So it's very much a Clausewitzian theory, not just of strategy, but of international politics. So I'm just saying this because it can be both, right? There are aspects of strategy that would, as you indicate, be in that sort of middle circle, but there are other aspects of strategy that go well beyond that. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that. And lastly, it was a fascinating aspect of your presentation when you talked about what you call the returnism. And I think you are absolutely spot on when you say, well, there is a return of deterrence, a return of the concern of the rivalries, the return of that. Now, I agree with you actually on this, but would you say actually that this is a sign of a real problem, right? If we perceive these things as returning, that implies that a number of scholars and perhaps practitioners thought that a number of these ideas or these phenomena had disappeared somehow, right? But maybe they had not disappeared at all, right? Maybe it's a sign. It could be analyzed as a sign of a flaw, an evolutionist belief that, it's gone, that deterrence is gone, that these things are over. And now we are simply realizing that they're not over, right? That we need to continue to engage in those fundamental aspects of international politics. Thank you. Thank you so much in advance.
Okay, thank you, Professor Vennesson. Professor Heng, would you like to respond to his questions first, or would you prefer that I begin to take in the questions that have been coming from our audience?
Maybe let me just quickly sort of respond. to Pascal, because I have to respond. Those are really, really thought-provoking, really stimulating questions. So I'll try to respond as quickly as I can, so we have more time for Pascal's response and also Q&A with the audience. Firstly, on the boundaries of security, absolutely, I completely agree with you. I shouldn't be saying that, but I agree with you that the boundaries are very broadly and vaguely defined. And this, I think, was one of the main criticisms of human security concepts, as you probably remember, whereby it was so broad, it was so vague, what counts as a security issue. And there were some proponents who suggested that even poverty might be a security issue as well, not gaining access to economic employment, that could also count as a security issue. So that's one very stark criticism of security studies. Where does it end? Where does it stop? Now, I think if you look at how questions, I think that might give us a bit of an answer to your question. So how are certain challenges driven to the top of the agenda? For example, we have scholars like Ole Wever in Copenhagen who's worked on securitization. Those are really questions about how policymakers or certain thought policy champions might want to promote certain issues and present them as existential challenges in a way that justify extraordinary responses on the part of the state or the government. So I think if we flip the question around somewhat and ask a slightly different question, right? How are certain issues becoming prominent, and how are governments actually responding to those questions? Then I think it might give us a sort of an answer to thinking about where the boundaries might lie, but unfortunately, it's still not clearly demarcated. And on uncertainty, you're right that it's not a particularly distinctive post-Cold War phenomenon, right? So security dilemma theory is always concerned about how to interpret the intentions of the other, and there's a lot of uncertainty in there. But I think what happens with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Berlin Wall, this actually triggered a vacuum which felt especially pronounced at that moment in time. And I suspect that we were to some extent caught up in the moment. As you know, all these discussions about the end of history and all these discussions about the triumph of liberalism. So how can we respond to all these questions? And with the end of the Cold War, no more monolithic threats from the Soviet Union, a threat that the Western world had spent 50, 60 years focusing intensely on. So I think the absence of this particular threat triggered this concern in terms of uncertainty far more than it might have been in previous periods of international relations. And I'll just make one quick point about returnism. And I've also said that it's very much about intellectual facts and fashions and trends in both strategic studies and also security studies. And these intellectual fashions tend to come and go. They wax and wane. So when we think about how certain theories and certain concepts tend to become apparently predominant at certain periods of time, then as events and the world changes, we find that, well, actually, the old concepts that we had before were pretty much adequate, right, to address these re-emerging security problems. And of course, with the end of the Cold War, we also saw a lot of hype about globalization. And I remember, reading a lot of globalization theories, talking about, how this was going to bring about a significant, fundamental transformation of the international system, such that, traditional interstate rivalry might no longer be prominent. We have the end of geographical distances, which were always seen as part and parcel of what we might call traditional security in the past. So I think this also sort of fed all these discussions about globalization. And then now we find that, well, actually, we still have these old-fashioned security challenges that still remain. We cannot wish them away, unfortunately. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Vennesson, would you like to respond to the questions that Kuang had initially posed to you, or would you like to take them as part of a series of Q&As with the audience?
I don't want to give the impression to Kuang that I dismiss his excellent point and his question, but perhaps in the interest of, because I see that we have already many questions in the chat, so perhaps I hope it's okay if we go ahead with the Q&A, and along the way, I would be pleased to go back to some of the very thoughtful points that were raised. And so Bernard, you can go ahead. If it's okay with everybody, right? Are we good?
So I've seen a number of trends, as it were, in the questions that have been posed from Chongwan and Albert Tai. This idea about maybe the Anglo-American centrism of strategic studies and possibly even security studies, right? Or at least the Eurocentrism of these subject areas, and whether or not a much more international, a much more cosmopolitan approach to the study is possible. Would you all like to respond to those questions from Chongwan and Albert?
Would you like me to start? Would you like me to start? Yes, sure. So yes. So first of all, thank you for these questions, and they do indicate to me that there is an interest in that question and in that problem. So I think it's good to know, and that also confirms my sense that there is indeed something there that should be further explored and further discussed. So let me give you two thoughts. So the first is. It's just a word of caution when we talk about Western centrism, right? So it's a word of caution in two ways. First of all, the notion of the West is actually quite complex and quite difficult to grapple, and not obvious, or less obvious than it sounds, number one. And number two, as far as strategic studies or strategic thinking is concerned, we cannot and we should not believe that there is such a thing as one West. I think that even within the West, there are multiple traditions due to historical experiences, geopolitical issues, particular bilateral relationship among countries. So in fact, now we're of course most familiar with things that have been translated into English, that are available in the UK, in the US. But what I said earlier about Clausewitz is an excellent example of that misguided view of what Clausewitz was interested in, due to the fact that many of his work had simply not been translated into English. Right? It doesn't take a PhD, right? Even though translating is not easy. But why is it big? So it tells you already that between Germany and German tradition of strategic thinking and British or US traditions, there were already considerable differences and considerable nuances. So it's just a word of, it's not like there is a Western box out there that is completely unified, uniform, and that we should take that we should approach in a simplistic way. Now, the second thing is that, yes, so I think that those questions, for example, on whether or not cultural factors or non-Western tradition give us different windows or different ways to approach strategic questions. And so to me, it's an empirical question. It's an empirical question. So first, we should know more about these ideas, these traditions, et cetera, and then whether or not we want to know whether there is a common mind between those ideas coming, let's say, from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Indonesia, and ideas which arose in the West. on specific issues, I think we should go ahead and study these things, right? Do we see evidence that in fact it's more a sort of a realpolitik type of thinking, not so much affected by culture, or do we see other things that could be traced to some strategic traditions in particular countries? So I would say that those are part of a fruitful, interesting, exciting research agenda. My final point on this is that it would also be interesting along those lines to study the circulation of strategic ideas. That is today, let's not forget that there is also this interesting point of non-Western country importing some strategic ideas, but connecting them to very specific national and cultural traditions. And that might result into a quite innovative result. We all know that, of course, with Japan, but it has also been true in China. After all, strategic thinkers have been translated, right? They've been translated in China. Clausewitz, to take only one example, has been translated in Japanese, translated in Chinese, translated in Vietnamese at some point. And of course, it's interesting to examine the other way around, right? Sun Tzu's idea is the perfect example, right? It's everywhere in Western countries, and thankfully some scholars have been already looking into this. But I think it's also this interesting thing, as you said, Bernard, I think we can really see that there is such a thing as a global strategic studies, right? It's with global roots and traditions. And within that environment, there are exchanges, right? There are exchanges, translations, adaptations of strategic ideas. To give another concrete example, in India's nuclear deterrence, we see the impact of ideas coming from strategic thoughts from elsewhere. But of course, they have been also adapted, transformed, adjusted in multiple ways, right? So I think it's interesting to look at those exchanges as well. So these would be my 2 cents of initial thoughts.
Professor Heng?
Well, Pascal has done a really excellent job answering the question. I'll just add my 1 cent's worth. And in thinking about risk prioritization, I think it's very useful to look at also risk perception as well. And as Pascal mentioned earlier, there is no monolithic West in the sense of how certain Western countries might perceive a risk. And I think the best example of this would be the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So the US perception of risk in Iraq was rather different from the French or the German perception of risk in Iraq. And this led to some extent to the French and Germans deciding that they didn't want to get along with the US intervention in Iraq. So I think the risk perception, even in the Western alliance itself, is quite divergent. And if you look at studies of risk perception, individuals have very subjective responses to information that they receive about a certain risk. So for example, the COVID crisis is another good example, right? We are told that behavioral responses are one way to manage the risks that we face, but we find that a whole range of different individuals respond in different ways, right? Not least leaders like Donald Trump, who was famously not keen on wearing a mask. So we see that even confronted with the same set of information, risk communications, the decisions, the responses that you make in terms of your behavior is itself very much dependent on individuals. So I think that makes it much more difficult to have this sort of common understanding of what constitutes an Eastern or a Western mind, especially when it comes to making choices on risk prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you. A second series of questions, particularly from Tin Lee and Hernan, really address how each of the 2 subject areas can begin to help us to understand or embrace dynamism in the international systems, whether or not these international systems are evolving, and the extent to which both subject areas can help us to begin to understand these changes in international politics. I would like, Kuang, would you have your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think if you look at security studies, for example, thinking about questions of agency, I think that's a good start. So as Pascal mentioned, it's a very broadly and vaguely defined boundary. But when you think in terms of agency, it does give you some insight into where and how a particular security challenge might manifest. So if you look, for example, at this field of existential risk, for example, one of the scenarios that's often touted is the probability of an asteroid collision with Earth. Now that agency itself is clearly non-human in that sense, right? Thinking about COVID and infectious diseases, the agency there again is more clearly described as a virus rather than a opposing human or adversarial human agent, right? So in that sense, security studies would allow at least analysts to think about where a potential threat might manifest and how and who or what, right, might bring that threat into reality. So in terms of the agency question, I think security studies could help us there, right? In terms of more systematically categorizing the nature, right, of the agency when it comes to better analyzing the security challenge. I'll stop here.
Pascal, would you like to weigh in on this?
Thank you so much. Yes, it's a great question, and I fully agree with what Kuang has just shared. Let me give you just one example, right? So today, I think it's fair to say that throughout the world, we see that in Southeast Asia, we see that in Europe, we will see that very soon of Afghanistan. Refugees, right? Refugees flux are a key issue, right? It's not a new issue. I'm not claiming that it is a new issue, but clearly it's part of a concern, right? In international politics, we've seen with the Rohingya in Burma and throughout Southeast Asia, elsewhere, et cetera, right? So about 10 years ago, Kelly Greenhill wrote a book called Weapons of Mass Migration. And I encourage you to check her book, right? That to me is an excellent example of someone using the tools, the ideas from strategic studies to analyze the logic, the process, the back and forth related to these questions of refugees when actually refugee flows are used as an instrument of influence, right? They can be, they're not always, right? But they can be part of a strategy of influence, in this case by states, but let's not forget that a number of non-state actors are also involved, right? After all, it's part of illicit international politics. And that to me is a very good illustration of someone really starting from a strategic studies standpoint, yet studying an issue that usually we would put in the security box, right? That doesn't look like the classical issue. Yet, thanks to her use of the notion of coercion, of the logic of compellence, raising a number of very insightful issues on this problem of refugee. Now, I'm not saying that she would provide an exhaustive analysis of the phenomena, but at least some aspect, in some cases, yes, it is such a phenomena can be shaped by strategic dynamic. So that's just an illustration of what we discussed so far.
Okay, third series of questions, I suppose inevitable, given that it's been the big international development over the last week, revolves around the question of Afghanistan and the American war and the coalition war effort there. So questions from Kumar, Usha, and Ernan. The question, but I suppose whether what sort of insights can both areas of study help us provide for us to make sense of what's happened to the coalition war effort in Afghanistan? Kuang, would you like to start?
Sure. I think we can look at the Afghanistan case. I think in different periods. I mean, it's a 20-year campaign, right? It's a forever war, endless war. So I think in terms of the utility of military tools, it was extremely useful in the early opening stages of the campaign, right? With the use of air power and U.S. Special Forces inserted into Afghanistan to support Northern Alliance forces against the Taliban, and that brought about a really swift outcome in a traditional sense, right, where the Taliban had withdrawn from Kabul, and that was seen as a military victory. Now, problem is what comes afterwards, and as we've seen, unfortunately, with the recent crisis, the military tool alone cannot address all these complex security issues that emerge in Afghanistan. So although President Biden has said, we need to be clear-minded in our focus on the initial reasons why the US intervened in Afghanistan, and that was, of course, in response to 9/11, right, and to eradicate or remove Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. But what comes afterwards becomes infinitely more complex, right? You have a good example, I think, of Mission Creep, where you have questions about, should we be supporting the eradication of poppy fields? Is it about, targeting the export of opium? Is it about bringing, elections and democracy to the country? Is it about, fostering human rights and education for girls and women's rights as well? All these are extremely important questions, but it then makes it much more complicated for the military tool to be involved. So we had the British Army, for example, engaged very heavily in Helmand province, and it was a very difficult mission where you have, military soldiers who are there to provide security, but they also have to think about how the Taliban was supporting itself through, opium, and to what extent should military forces be involved in destroying a poppy field in Afghanistan. So it is an incredibly complex situation, which military tools in the traditional sense of war fighting are not necessarily the most suited for. And Ernan also raised a question about France as well in the Sahel. And a lot of these situations very much depend on your local partners as well. So I think in France's case, it was very much concerned about the local regimes in the Sahel region, which France was having to work with, and all these questions about increasingly dictatorial, authoritarian leaders that were emerging and affecting, human rights concerns there as well. So I think France in recent years has also increasingly become, much more wary about its position in the Sahel as well. It's been described as one of the most dangerous peacekeeping missions in the world for UN peacekeeping operations. So it is in a way a similar question in terms of the complexity of situations on the ground, which intervening foreign military forces are not necessarily well placed to address. So I'll pass it over to Pascal then.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, I think it's only fair, right? We open ourselves to these kinds of questions about, you know, what should be done about the Taliban, and what do you think about the situation of Afghanistan? So thank you so much for the question. It's great. So let me perhaps share 3 quick thoughts on this. And again, you know, it's a rapidly changing situation. There is also lots of information that are still uncertain. So it's only 3 limited thoughts. So my first thought, and I honestly, I think that I must say that the media coverage, including the US media coverage, has been, I think, a bit unfair to the Biden administration here. And I don't think the media coverage has been doing exactly what Kuang just suggested. That is to say, to bring back the current events into the context of 9/11, right? And I want to just, my first point would say that, first of all, the Afghanistan, as Kuang just reminded us, was a campaign, not the entire war. The entire war was the war on terror, and the entire war was a war against a number of transnational jihadi groups, which initially were Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden, and then after a number of strategic blunders, it is true, morphed into ISIS, and with a blend of political religious ideology being, quite transnational. So now, in that context, now, even though the current situation is really problematic in many ways and shows that indeed a number of mistakes have been made, and yes, for the Afghan people, I don't think that's a great news, to say the least. But let's not forget that in this broader war, last time I checked, Al-Qaeda today is not as powerful than it used to be, and Osama bin Laden has been killed. ISIS has been also dramatically reduced, or destroyed as such. Al-Baghdadi has been killed. So there has been actually a number of success, right? Now, success is never perfect in strategy, but there has been a number of things that actually worked in that. Now, they were maybe done clumsily. It could have been done differently, and that is true. But I think that we should keep in mind that the initial reason for the US intervention in Afghanistan, initially, right, at the very early stage, was not intrinsically against the Taliban. It's only because the Taliban regime at that time decided to host and not to do much vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Let me also remind you that last time I checked, before 9/11, the US had a bilateral relation with the Taliban regime at that time, right? They met. I'm sure many of you remember, because of course the pictures and TV clips came out of a visit of Taliban dignitaries in Washington, meeting Vice President Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, etc. So it was related not to the Taliban per se, but to the connection with Al-Qaeda and with transnational jihadism, group using force under the form of terrorism. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, just following up on what Kuang said, to me, there is still an open debate about whether or not the war is over, right? People seem to be jumping to the conclusion that because the Taliban is back in Kabul, somehow the so-called war on terror, the war going on with some of jihad group, is over. Let me tell you, yesterday, it was in the news. I recognize I'm biased. I'm listening to French news on Radio France Internationale, the equivalent of BBC World Service. 65 people have been killed in Burkina Faso. Among these 65 civilian peasants working in their field, there were, I think, 10 or 15 police officers, right? So if we are talking about a change in the theater of operations, yes, most probably, and I do recognize that, as always, it's not, you know, it's a mixture of conflict in complex region where there are multiple groups, multiple, etc., etc. But I am not completely sure. Now, right now, the Sahel region, it's not just Burkina Faso, it's also Niger, it's also nearby Chad. There's also the question of Boko Haram, which is also transnational in that area, seem to be, you know, pretty characterized by violence, partially at least politically motivated by political ideologies and things like that. So you know, I think we should take that into account. My final sort of thought on this is that I believe that, and I must say, I've been concerned and I've been slightly troubled by the ways in which the Chinese media has been reporting the events in Afghanistan, as well as apparently the Chinese bloggers or things like that, right? It seems to, I hope that at the top they're not making the same mistake, but it seems that there is this perception out there that because the US has withdrawn in such a way from Afghanistan, it's a massive failure of the United States, and that therefore the US is weak, and that the US, it shows that maybe it's a paper tiger. Or when I'm hearing this, frankly, I'm sweating and I'm starting to panic, because that would be a massive strategic mistake. And if people are trying to derive conclusions from what happened in this particular episode, supported by the Trump administration, supported by the Biden administration, and start deriving some conclusion about US behavior in general, I think, you know, we're in trouble. I think we're in trouble. It could lead to massive miscalculation. And I think people should not think in such ways. It's true that there has been some limits, as was said, about how to deal with a counterinsurgency and these kind of things. But that does not mean that the US would behave in the same way in the different contexts, such as Taiwan, or such as the relationship with Japan, or with other countries in Asia. That would be, to me, a massive mistake if that was the crystallized perception or conclusion or implications of what happened in Afghanistan.
Okay, there's actually a lot more questions, and I apologize to all everybody who's contributed that we're not able to address all of your questions due to the constraints of time that we have. But I'm going to leave the last set of questions to my colleagues Bhupinder and Ambassador Ong, because they've basically gone back to the so what questions. How can schools teach these subject areas, right? How can small countries like Singapore begin to understand use the concepts in both areas of study to help them to navigate the policies ahead? So then we go to Professor Heng, and then we'll end with Professor Vennesson.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bhupinder. I would expect that question from you, actually. Well, I teach security studies here in Tokyo, and I sort of grapple with that question as well. And you know, it's also related to how you set the boundaries for security studies. And increasingly, I find that when I assign readings for my students, it's not just from security studies journals, but also from strategic studies journals as well. And I myself have published in both sets of journals. So I always encourage my students to think of the overlaps between security and strategy. And if you want to have good strategy, you also need to know, you know, what your security challenges are, right? You need to be aware of the nature of security challenges that you face, and then you're able to formulate a well thought out strategy. In theory, that would be the ideal case. So I tend to adopt a rather sort of flexible approach, sort of holistic approach. And although my course is labeled security studies in strictly speaking terms, but I also touch on strategy and also military operations as well in my classes. So that's how I think we should encourage our students to not think in very narrow-minded terms, where you have security studies here and you have strategic studies there. It's not like that at all. Although Pascal and myself, we look at different things from different angles, and there are distinct differences between security studies and strategic studies. But to equip our students to better understand increasingly complex world, we do need to draw insights and learning from both security studies and strategic studies as well. Pascal.
Thank you so much. So let me address Ambassador Heng's question, and which I think is an excellent point. So I would have two ways to share some thoughts about how could a country such as Singapore, familiar with both Western Asian concepts or ideas, would actually navigate those realities, and how would it be possible to involve perhaps more the general public in that conversation. So the first thing that I would say is that, in my view, Singapore remains one of the best locations to precisely engage in those conversations about what I mentioned earlier as being grand strategy, right? The Asia Pacific and the world, right? Not just the Asia Pacific only, or not just ASEAN countries only, but ASEAN countries or the Asia Pacific in relationship with broader dynamics out there. And I really believe that there are a number of assets in Singapore, a general openness on these things. Among the things that we do at RSIS, we're not the only one, but I think can help that. And it's absolutely correct. I think if we compare to other countries, I believe that from among these assets is the fact that we are pretty internationalized, and we are engaging in those dialogues in multiple ways, and connecting also not just one Asia, but also different Asias, right? It's not just North Asia, but it's also Southeast Asia. So I think Singapore could continue and should continue to build up on that, what I continue to see as a strength. And that's true intellectually, right? It's true in the scholarly exchange, and it is also true in the policy exchange. And we have outstanding example of scholars who've been doing that. Professor Wang Gongwu would be, to me, a reference point in someone who has been doing exactly or showing the way from that perspective. So from this perspective, I continue to think that Singapore is a great place in a broad sense to do that. The second thing is that I completely agree with what you indicated about the fact that in today's world, the public at home, right, so-called ordinary citizens, matter a great deal for both strategic and security questions. And you are right. And if my own perspective in Singapore is that I've seen a trend in which many Singaporeans, not all, obviously, but many Singaporeans are turning inward. There is a trend towards localism. Perhaps some in other traditions, some could say perhaps isolationism, right? Now, I don't want to exaggerate that, but there is this tendency. And I believe that I would agree that it is also our responsibility to contribute to a broader education. Of course, citizens can think the way they want, but highlight the fact that the connections between Singapore and the world do matter. And ultimately, they matter predominantly for Singaporeans themselves, for the good of the country in some ways. So finding ways to contribute to a broader strategic and security education, right? Targeting a broader audience is, I think, something that perhaps should be considered and should be envisioned in different ways. In our small way, we're doing it already at RSIS, but I think it's a fair question to ask whether or not this could be broadened or can involve different kinds of learners with different skills, and we would need to adapt to them in order to have a broader conversation, certainly in Singapore and other countries as well, but in Singapore, within the public at home, on those issues. It should not, in short, to me, this should not remain a sort of elite discussion. I don't think it's a good idea, and I believe there would be ways to engage more with a broader audience, and we should indeed think about that and perhaps come up with initiatives in that regard.
On that note, I'm very conscious of time and that I'm standing in between lunch and you. I apologize to those of you who have posed questions which have not been able to be addressed in this forum, but I would like to thank all of you for having contributed to such a lively discussion and about the two subject areas. I would like to thank especially our two speakers, Professor Heng and Professor Vennesson, for having helped us to begin to understand that these are not necessarily discrete and antagonistic subject areas, but we ought to be able to see that they do overlap, they do interact as and when necessary. And at the end of the day, both of them may be necessary to help us begin to understand the very complex security issues that we are now facing in the 21st century. And by understanding these problems, maybe helping us to begin to think about how we can navigate our way through these challenges. Thank you, everybody, once again, and I wish everybody a good day. Thank you very much.